Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Fellow Feeling. This will be Part 8, Chapter 7, entitled Tall Shadows. When Shouta is led to Bakugo's hospital room, the first thing he notices is, ridiculously, his hair. It's a stupid thing to notice, but some combination of grease and sweat and lying flat on the hospital bed has slicked it down, making him look like something of a Pomeranian, and it makes the situation feel a little less horrifying. Because it is horrifying. He'll never get used to seeing his students laid up in hospitals. Until this year, it had happened maybe a grand total of 5 times in his career, emphasis on the maybe, and all of those had been typical accidents. A student during his first year of teaching had gotten a concussion during training, for example, and another had broken their leg a few years after that. Nothing serious and nothing unexpected. Only this year, this has become the norm. Bakugo looks up at him as he enters, his eyes sunken and tired. He looks haggard. That's the best word for it, Shouta thinks. Like he's been beat down and stepped on, and he's struggling to get back up. The bags under his eyes are so deep that they almost look like bruises, and there's a litany of actual bruises there too, spread across his right cheekbone and smeared across his brow as if he's been painted with them. There's a scar over his eye, faded and pink as if a healing quirk had closed the wound that caused it. The rest of him is hidden, swallowed up beneath a white blanket, but Shouta can imagine that he's come away from this encounter with a sizable amount of scarring. "You're alive," Bakugo observes, his voice low and hoarse. Shouta blinks. "I should be saying that about you." Bakugo just sniffs and reaches to one side, fumbling with his bed's controls until it begins to rise, lifting him into a sitting position. As his arm leaves the safety of the blanket, Shouta sees a swath of bandages wrapped around it. As the blanket falls even lower, tugged away from his shoulder by the slope of the bed, he sees that he's wearing one of those awful, scratchy surgical gowns, probably so the staff has easy access to what remains of his wounds. Bandages stretch from under its hem, creeping up over his shoulders. Wincing, Bakugo draws his arm back under the blanket. What remains of his injuries must still be giving him trouble. "I'm fine," he says entirely unconvincingly. "It'll take more than a shit show like that to kill me." Of course. Shouta steps further into the room. No one else is here at the moment, though he does note a small bundle of flowers and a vase at Bakugo's bedside. "Where are your parents?" Another wince. "My dad is at work. My mom went with Auntie a few hours ago." "Auntie?" "Deku's mom. They're in the ICU." "Oh." Avoiding the rather delicate topic, he hasn't gotten any updates on Midoriya's condition, which he takes to mean that nothing has changed. He lowers himself into the chair at Bakugo's bedside. His cast is downright unwieldy, knocking the armrest as he sits, and he glares at it for the great offense it's committed. Bakugo snorts. "They couldn't heal you either, huh? Bastard said I was too exhausted, so I still have a bunch of disgusting cuts all over me." "I suppose that's the price we pay for getting ourselves buried beneath a building," he says, though the sentence tastes sour and wrong against his tongue. He knows as well as anyone else that it had been his own uninformed decisions that had led them to stand in that villain's path, and while he knows better than to blame himself for the whole thing, it doesn't mean that he feels guiltless. Bakugo looks away bitterly, but he doesn't point out the obvious, and distantly, Shouta wonders how furious he is with him for deciding to take them on that patrol in the first place. "Did they give you a release date yet?" Shouta asks, trying to distract him. A shrug. "They said I could leave after one more healing session. A few days, maybe. I just have to convince the idiots that I'm strong enough for them to use their quirks on." "And after you're released?" "I'll be going back to UA. What the fuck else would I do?" It's said angrily, almost defensively. "Stupid extras haven't been around to visit yet, but they're probably falling apart without the best hero in class around to make them remember how shitty they all are." He laughs. He can't help it. It bubbles up in his throat before he realizes it's there. "What the fuck, are you laughing at me?" Then odd. "I don't think I've ever heard you laugh before." He just shakes his head. It's not as if he'd meant to laugh. He just slipped. A moment of hysterical relief, he thinks, upon realizing that at least one of his students is going to be okay. Although the events of that terrible patrol hadn't even lasted a full day, it feels like it's been forever, and it's nice to find just a shred of normalcy. But then he remembers Midoriya, lying still in the ICU, and his relief fades. Bakugo seems to sense it. He looks down at his hands, rubbing bitterly at the bandages that ensnare his wrists and forearms and scowls, like he's chewing on something but isn't sure how to bring it up. "Hey," he says, finally, like it physically pains him to speak. "Maybe you can tell me something." Shouta arches a brow. "What is it?" He glances at the door as if making sure the coast is clear. "I can't remember." "You can't remember?" Defensively. "Well, I remember some of it. What do you think I am, stupid? It's just the very end. Everything kind of goes white after a certain point. It's not like I can ask anyone else what happened." Chest tightening, Shouta thinks back to those terrible last moments before Bakugo had lost consciousness. The way he'd screamed, desperate and in pain, poised to attack anyone and everyone that dared to take a step too close. The way he'd blasted that villain with more strength than Shouta had even known he possessed, knocking him back and giving Ryuku the perfect opportunity to swoop in and take him down. The way he'd fallen, slumping back over Midoriya like a wet blanket. He doesn't want Bakugo to remember something so horrific. "What do you remember?" he asks carefully, as a means of gauging the situation. Bakugo scrunches up his nose. "Everything before you went to get help is pretty vivid. Then after you left, Deku and I stayed put and waited until we heard a noise down the tunnel. We thought it was you, but..." "It was the villain," Shouta finishes, because he can guess what had happened next based off of how he'd found them. Bakugo gives a short nod. He shifts like he wants to curl in on himself, but the bandages keep him from doing so. "Deku was barely breathing," he says, clinical, like an outsider looking in on a terrible tragedy, like it's the only way he can stand to talk about it. I knew he couldn't take another hit. I knew that I could, so I just..." "Stepped in front of him." His breath shortens. "Yeah. I remember taking 1 or 2 hits, but that's it. Blacked out and woke up here." It's probably for the best that he doesn't remember the details of those awful few minutes before the paramedics had arrived. Shouta isn't sure his pride could handle remembering the way he'd clung to Midoriya like a child, threatening anyone who had gotten even an inch too close. He doesn't need to know, at least not while he's still recovering. "The villain knocked you out," he settles on, because it's not too far from the truth. "I arrived with help before you were killed, and Ryuku managed to subdue the villain. The paramedics reached us shortly after, and you know the rest." "And..." He swallows hard. "Did I..." Shouta blinks, unable to piece together the question that Bakugo's so desperately trying to avoid asking. "Did you what?" A beat of silence. Heavy. Miserable. "Did I protect him?" Shouta is fairly certain he feels his heart shatter. "You protected him bravely," is what he says, though his throat feels strangely clogged all of a sudden. "The villain didn't lay another claw on him." It seems to bring him some peace of mind, Shouta thinks. Bakugo leans back, breath leaving him in a whoosh, and he suddenly looks more exhausted than tense. "Thank God," he whispers, so quiet that Shouta almost can't hear him. "You worried that you hadn't?" Bakugo bristles. "What the fuck else am I supposed to think? The doctors won't tell me shit about Deku. My own parents won't even say a word except to tell me that he's in critical condition. I thought maybe..." He thought that he might have failed him. That he might have let the villain past him, let him sink his claws into Midoriya for a second time. That Midoriya's condition is his fault. Shouta reaches out a hand, not quite laying it on Bakugo's arm, but instead grasping the armrest of his hospital bed. It's the closest thing to an embrace that his student will accept. "You did not fail him," he says, low and serious. "You defended him, even at the risk of your own life, and you kept him safe until the paramedics arrived. You saved him." But Bakugo doesn't look reassured. "He's in the ICU. I've heard the doctors talking in the halls. They don't know if he'll survive." "I know. But even if he doesn't, it won't be because you failed him." Shouta could be imagining it, but he swears that in the very corners of Bakugo's eyes, he sees the glimmer of forming tears. They never fall. Bakugo blinks furiously, ducking his head, and his eyes are dry by the time he looks up again, but it doesn't change the fact that Shouta had seen it. "Shit," Bakugo mutters under his breath, rubbing at his face. Then, in a desperate bid for distraction, "I guess that means you don't have any updates on the nerd either." "Not since yesterday, no. But Midoriya is strong. and he's been through worse. I'm sure he'll be okay. Bakugo glares. Don't lie to me. They fall into silence, Bakugo still glaring, turning his gaze on his hands after it becomes apparent that Shouta isn't going to give him any more information. Distantly, Shouta mourns the fact that this event has seemingly only added to the trauma that rests heavily on his students' shoulders. His attempt to ease their burden has only made it that much heavier. He doesn't regret trying to help Midoriya and Bakugou. They needed it, clearly. They still do. But he does regret going about it like this. He should have taken more care in the way he handled them, spent more time trying to figure out before he chucked them into such a volatile situation. Of all the mistakes he's made in his career, this one is perhaps the most devastating. He just wishes... So are you going to ask me about it or not? Shouta blinks, caught off guard by the unprompted and agitated demand. Ask you about what? He questions, confused. About Deku, what else? We had a deal, remember? Struggling to orient himself, he frowns. A deal? Then, in a flash, he remembers. Get Deku out of here alive, and I'll tell you everything you want to know about our past. And he wilts because Bakugo is hurt, and Midoriya could be dying, and he still thinks that digging into their past is Shota's biggest priority. At the time he'd made that deal, he'd felt like he'd won his struggle to puzzle out the tension between the students. He'd thought, now I'll finally understand. And he'd wanted that. He'd wanted to know everything, because he didn't understand Midoriya and Bakugo, and he thought that learning about their past would be the key in the lock of their aggressive behavior. Now he knows better. His students need help. That hasn't changed, but now he understands how terribly delicate the situation truly is, and recognizes how inconsiderate and heavy-handed his attempts at reconciliation had been. Trying to wring answers out of his students about something so obviously delicate had been wrong. If Bakugo wants to tell him about his past on his own time, he'll gladly listen, but he's not going to force him. He's especially not going to force him after an event as traumatic as this, while he's still lying in the hospital bed, with half-healed wounds concealed beneath his clothing. It was a stupid deal, he says, which makes Bakugo's eyes go wide. Consider it broken. What? You were so insistent before. Are you telling me that you're just going to drop it? It was wrong of me to accept that deal in the first place, he says as Bakugo steadily turns redder and redder. I thought I understood your dynamic with Midoriya, and I was wrong. You don't owe me an explanation just because I made a few incorrect assumptions. Bakugo's jaw drops. You're kidding. You're fucking kidding, right? I'm not kidding, he says simply. You don't owe me answers, but what you do owe me is to give someone answers. That makes Bakugo pause. His shock is replaced with suspicion, eyeing Shouta as if he means to trick him into doing something he doesn't want to do. You mean a shrink, he says. The school has a counseling department for a reason, Shouta tells him, because knowing what he knows now, Bakugo should have been in therapy years ago. Your past with Midoriya is clearly rocky. Still, you owe it to both yourself and him to deal with it in a way that doesn't end in this, and the two of you hurting each other time and time again. I took both of you on that patrol because I thought the animosity between you would lead to other people getting hurt, even dying, once you became pros. And even though I understand now that the situation isn't what I thought it was, you still need help, Bakugo. If you can't do it for yourself, then do it for all the people you could put in danger by not dealing with this. Bakugo just stares at him for a moment, caught off guard. Then something clicks behind his eyes, and he says, You really thought we were going to kill each other, huh? I thought a lot of things, most of them incorrect. But, yes, I thought you were a danger to each other. It seemed like every time you were in the same place, you were at each other's throats. It's like I told you. If you go into the field with that mentality, people will die. Innocent people. A long, heavy pause, until finally, in a single breath, Bakugo deflates. Shit, he whispers again, rubbing at his eyes. This is so out of control. Silence hangs between them. Shouta doesn't dare break it. It's just... Bakugo huffs like he's struggling to find words. It's not like I didn't know it was out of control, but it's gone too far, way too fucking far. More silence. The machinery hums quietly at Bakugo's bedside. It takes a long moment, but as Bakugo sits there, staring at his hands, touching delicately at his bandages, he seems to come to some kind of decision. When he looks up, his expression is grim but firm. Okay, he says. Okay. What?
Okay, I'll talk to the stupid therapist and...
He fidgets.
I'm going to uphold my end of the deal.
I told you, the deal is...
Bakugo snaps. I know you think it's stupid, but I don't. You're owed the truth after putting up with our shit for this long, and I'm the only one awake to tell you.
He's hit with a mix of respect and dread. Respect for Bakugo that he would be willing to bear what is obviously such a painful part of his past, and dread that he's about to find out exactly what it is that made him cling to Midoriya so desperately. I'm listening, he says simply. The reassurance only seems to make Bakugo feel that much more unnerved. He glances at him nervously, as if giving himself one last chance to back down. But he set his mind to this clearly, and Shouta has learned the hard way that there is no convincing Bakugo to go back on his word. He opens his mouth and begins to speak. It's not a pleasant story.
Deku and I were 5 when it started, he says low. I don't remember much of it, but I've been able to piece it together based on what Mom and Auntie Inko have told me. Deku's dad was, well, you've already figured it out, a real grade A bastard. He had Deku with Auntie Inko by accident. They weren't even married, it was just a goddamn mistake, but Auntie was a good person, and once she figured out that Deku was going to be born, she thought that the right thing to do was to get married and settle down, to be a good mom for him. The bastard had other plans, though. Apparently he'd been tolerable up until that point, but he stopped trying to hide his true nature after he found out Auntie was pregnant. Started drinking, began shoving her around, started treating her like dirt. He even hit her in the stomach once. She was in the hospital for days. Mom would never confirm it, but I think that...
A breath, short and hysterical.
I think he wanted to kill Deku before he was even born.
He pauses, clenches his fist so hard, his fingers in the sheets that Shouta fears they might tear. And with good reason. The thought of a man trying to kill his unborn child, going so far as to strike his pregnant wife in the gut, is enough to make him feel like dying. Bakugo gives a furious sniff, like he's angry at himself or crying.
He couldn't do it, though. Auntie was too strong. She had Deku, and after that bastard met him for the first time, he supposedly mellowed out for a while. But just for a while. I think he resented Deku for ruining his life or something. He didn't want a kid. He didn't want to get married. He only did it because his family shamed him into taking responsibility. I wish they hadn't, though. They just made things worse. After a year went by, Deku's dad started to change again, ditching the upstanding citizen act and started acting on impulses. Getting drunk, yelling, pushing Auntie around. I don't know how bad it got, but Auntie has scars. I've seen them. He was always kind of cold to Deku, but I think it really started after he turned 3. Apparently he'd come to the park with bruises, and he was really skittish. I remember meeting him and thinking that he was so small. Like, he was a good inch shorter than everyone else our age. And because Mom and Auntie became friends after that, I used to see Deku all the time. He was always hurt. He used to give me stupid stories about falling down the stairs or hitting his head on the kitchen counter. I believed him because I was a stupid kid who didn't know any better. Except one day, Deku ended up in the hospital.
Another pause. Bakugo suddenly seems exceedingly interested in his own hands.
Mom still won't tell me what happened, he says. But it's not hard to figure out. Deku's dad hit him so hard he ended up in the emergency room. And when he finally came back, he was different. He'd always been skittish, but now he was terrified of the world. Apparently he used to cling to me. Our moms always took us to the park to play, and whenever it was time to leave, he tried to hold on to my arm so he didn't have to go back. And I used to push him off of me like he was some kind of bug asking to be squashed. Thought he was just being dramatic. When I turned 5, I still hadn't met Deku's dad, and I still hadn't put it all together. But for my birthday, Mom wanted to have a party. Since we were having our living room remodeled and lived right next to Deku, Auntie offered to help us host the party at her apartment. She thought that Deku's dad would be on a business trip. She thought it would be safe. Well, that evening, after the other guests had gone, our moms decided to let the two of us play together for a little while longer while they cleaned up. Auntie had run out of paper towels, so Mom went with her next door to grab some. They were only gone for a few minutes. That was all it took. Deku's dad had gotten fired that day, so he never even left for the business trip he was supposed to be on. Instead, he went out and drank himself under the table, then bought a bottle of vodka for the walk home. When he showed up, he was so drunk that he could barely stand up, and Deku and I were the only ones there. Shouta's heart doesn't just sink. It plummets. I knew something was wrong the instant he walked in the door. Deku got so quiet, and he tried to get me to follow him back to his room. I think he wanted me to hide. Stupid nerd was trying to protect me. But I was a stubborn brat, so I didn't listen to him. I never met Deku's dad, and I was curious. Silence for a moment. Bakugo sniffs. I'm not sure exactly what triggered it initially. Being fired, coming home to a messy house, finding a child he didn't know in his living room, or maybe his hatred of Deku finally just spilled over into something darker. But the instant he saw us, he started screaming. I couldn't even understand him. That's how drunk he was. But I know he was angry. And I had this feeling that he was actually going to hurt someone. He reached for Deku and... He shudders. There was this look in his eye, like he was really seriously going to kill him. I didn't know what abuse was, but I knew that Deku wasn't okay, had never been okay. And I guess I just subconsciously put it all together. I knew that a hero would never stand by while a villain hurt an innocent person, so I... A breath. Short, stuttering, desperate, like the act of remembering is just as devastating as the actual event. I stepped in front of him, Bakugo whispers, and he attacked me instead. The scene flashes in front of Shouta's eyes, cold and terrifying, and though he doesn't scare easily, he thinks that the mental image of a 5-year-old Bakugo throwing himself in front of a full-grown man, taking the beating meant for Midoriya, will haunt him for the rest of his life. Bakugo takes a deep, shaking breath, burying his head momentarily in his hands. When he looks up, his voice is steady again, but only just. It's a blur, but I remember that he was screaming, and Deku was crying, and it was just... Another breath, quick, urgent, like he's trying not to hyperventilate. It was the worst day of my life. He me backed into a corner, hand around my neck, and Deku was just sobbing. The heart rate monitor picks up, giving an urgent beep, and Shouta shoots it an anxious glance. Bakugo, he tries, the word landing flat in the stagnant hospital air, but his student doesn't stop. He doesn't even consider it. And then, he chokes. Deku, he fucking punched the bastard in the back. He was the scrawniest, most anxious kid in our whole apartment complex, and he thought his dad was going to kill me, and he punched him. Why would he do that? He was a kid. You were a kid, Shouta wisely doesn't say. And by that point, I was done. One of my broken ribs had stuck one of my lungs, though I didn't know it yet. My vision was all fuzzy. So Deku's dad turned around, realized that he punched him, and he just snapped. He sniffs again, wetly, scrubbing at the tears that gather in the corners of his eyes, as if he can erase them with his hands alone. It was bad. I mean, Aizawa-sensei, he was... Another sniff. He nearly died. The room is deathly still. In the back of his mind, Shouta hears Bakugo scream, not again, except now it holds terrible weight. He tried to kill him, Bakugo rasps, wrapped his arms around Deku's throat and just... But he gags around the final word, unable to continue. Deku wouldn't stop kicking. He was dangling from his neck, and he kept trying to fight. And after he passed out and his dad kept choking him, I realized that he was actually going to kill him, that he wasn't going to stop, so I pushed. I pushed and my quirk manifested. The silence that falls, then, is thick and absolute. Shouta had lied. The image of Bakugo throwing himself in front of Midoriya is consumed by the image of him lashing out, hands crackling with explosions, in a desperate bid to stop his friend from being strangled to death before his very eyes. How could someone do such a thing to a child? Bakugo tries to curl in on himself again, and this time he succeeds despite the bandages. The heart rate monitor gives another kick. I didn't know, he says, like he's trying to convince himself as much as Shouta. Neither of my parents have a quirk like this, so I wasn't expecting to explode. And when it happened, I wasn't trying to fight that bastard. I was trying to pull Deku out of his arms. Oh. I was holding on to him, and I hurt him. Badly. Shouta is going to be sick. The noise scared Deku's dad, so he tried to run, but he was so drunk that the instant he tried to turn around, he slipped and bashed his head on the edge of the coffee table, and he died. He balks. Midoriya's father died. Not instantly, but the corner of the table had these little metal rivets in him that hit him in the temple in just the wrong way, and he bled to death in his brain. Combined with the amount of alcohol he'd consumed, it didn't take long. Bastard was dead before he reached the hospital. He'd been 5 years old. It had been his birthday, and he'd watched Midoriya's father try to strangle him to death. Had watched an adult man hit his head so hard he died. And Midoriya's own father, had tried to kill him. Suddenly, the complex mismatch of protectiveness and aggression that comprises Bakugo's relationship with Midoriya makes a lot more sense.
Bakugo continues.
Mom and Auntie came back right at the end of it. They heard the screaming and knew something was wrong. By the time they found us, Deku was unresponsive and I was drowning in my own blood. They called an ambulance and the cops and the rest.
He shakes his head.
It wasn't good. We were in the hospital for a week straight, and things were never the same after.
That had been the moment then. The moment their relationship had gone from normal to this.
We were kids, and we've been through something fucking awful.
Bakugo's fingers bite into his own arms almost viciously.
We should have had help, but Deku was too scared of making Auntie worry to tell her that he needed to talk to someone, and I was too prideful. Our families took us home, and things got worse and worse. Our moms assumed that since we'd been through that experience together, we would benefit from being around each other as a form of coping or some shit. Like, we would comfort each other because we knew what the other had experienced, but that's not what happened. We started to hate each other, or at least, I started to hate Deku. I hated that he tried to defend me, and I hated that he nearly died because I wasn't strong enough to stand up to his dad. Looking back now, it's so stupid. Deku's dad was an adult man and I was 5. But I thought Deku was looking down on me. Watching him, all I could think about was that night and how he could have died because he thought I couldn't handle myself. But he was right. I couldn't handle it. He saved my life and I hated him for it. And Deku, he didn't hate me. He was afraid of me. For a long time, whenever he heard my explosions, he would lock up. He associated my quirk with that night, and I hated him for that, too. He wasn't okay. It was so obvious. The longer it went on, the jumpier he got, and eventually got so bad that we couldn't even look at each other without breaking into a fight. And the worst part is, I didn't even really hate him. I hated myself for being too weak to defend him that night. I was supposed to be a hero, but Deku was the one that had to save me. That's what I hated. But still, I couldn't bring myself to stop hurting him.
And there it is. It's the answer Shouta had been looking for. This strange, destructive dance they've been doing, circling each other in flashes of anger, aggression, and fear. Now it all makes sense. They don't hate each other. They hate what they'd gone through together, and for all the years it's been since that night, they still have no clue how to handle it. The trauma is so deep, so ingrained, that untangling their emotions might be impossible. But not entirely impossible, Shouta thinks, because down in that tunnel, Bakugo had put his life on the line to protect Midoriya. He'd proven that despite the tons of grief and anxiety piled atop their shoulders, there's still something there. Something workable. If Midoriya survives, maybe this incident will show him that they still care about each other, that whatever friendship they'd had as children, it hadn't been destroyed entirely. You almost died trying to protect him, Shouta says softly. Twice. So you're right. That doesn't sound like hate to me. Bakugo gives an uncomfortable shrug.
But you did think it was hate up until now. That's why you dragged us out on that patrol together.
Yes, he admits. Like I said, that patrol was meant to address what I perceived as hatred between you. I wanted to build some sense of trust, I suppose, to convince both you and Midoriya that you could work together. And I'm sorry for that. I should have tried to talk to you both individually before I put you in such an uncomfortable situation.
If you'd tried to talk to either of us, we wouldn't have said a thing. That patrol was bound to happen sooner or later.
Maybe, but that doesn't mean he doesn't feel responsible for how things have turned out.
You couldn't have known, Bakugo says roughly. Deku and I, our past is complicated. And I'm sure you're right. If we get out into the field the way we are now, someone will probably die while we're busy screaming at each other. You made the right call, trying to get us to work through our shit before that happened.
Shouta just wishes that it hadn't had to end like this.
Meddling where you don't belong is the essence of being a hero, Bakugo murmurs. All Might said something like that once, didn't he?
He's so caught off guard that it takes a moment for him to put a coherent thought together. He does remember Yagi saying something along those lines, though he's never given it much consideration until now.
Well, I think that makes you a hero. You stuck your nose somewhere it didn't belong, and people got hurt. But if you hadn't, Deku and I probably would have killed someone.
He shakes his head.
I don't know. Maybe this was inevitable.
Shouta has no clue how to respond to that, but he has to say something, so he settles on. You paid him back, you know.
A frown. What is that supposed to mean?
I mean, if you're saying Midoriya saved your life, you paid him back for that. If you hadn't stood in front of him when that villain attacked, he would have been killed.
Bakugo snorts. Let's wait to hand out any medals until we know if he's going to live. The mood drops sharply. The sounds of the hospital trickle from underneath the door, growing momentarily louder as someone begins to approach. They stop before they make it all the way to the door, however, and a high, unfamiliar voice calls something about having misplaced the clipboard for the UA student. Bakugo shoots a listless glance at the door. He seems drained, Shouta thinks. Like whatever strength he's managed to regain since the attack, this conversation has sapped it right back out of him. "That's probably the nurse," he says. "She's supposed to check on me soon. She'll probably kick you out." Right. Message received. Shouta gets to his feet, wincing as his arm settles back into his sling. After such a heavy conversation, the least he can do is give his student time to process things. Besides, it's clear that Bakugo is done talking, at least for the moment. "I'll be back," he threatens, which makes Bakugo huff. "But in the meantime, I'm going to set up a counseling session for you back at UA." "Of course you are," Bakugo grumbles, though he doesn't protest. "Stubborn bastard, won't even give me a moment's rest." "If you need rest, I could easily issue a leave of absence. How does a week sound?" To anyone else, it would be a kind gesture, but Bakugo pales, protesting. "I take it back. You're not stubborn, you're cruel." "Guilty," is the flat response. "Now get some rest. I'll be back to see you tomorrow." He ruffles Bakugo's hair on impulse, which restores some of its spikiness, but he doesn't make it more than a few steps towards the door before he's stopped. "Aizawa-sensei," Bakugo blurts out. "Wait." So he stops, turning back to face his student, except Bakugo just stares at him for a long moment, eyes wide like even he can't figure out why he'd stopped him. But after so many years, Shouta has gotten good at reading his students, and though Bakugo had taken him several months and a near-death experience to crack, he thinks that he finally understands him. "Bakugo," he says firmly, "none of this has been your fault." Silence. Bakugo watches him. "You were 5 years old. Midoriya was 4. It wasn't your job to protect him. It was his father's. So if you're looking to place blame, you should place it where it belongs, on the man so evil that he would beat a 4-year-old child for fun." Something in Bakugo's expression cracks. "And you have to understand, Midoriya trying to save you doesn't mean that he looks down on you. It doesn't mean that he thinks you're weak. It means that he cares about you, and just like you were willing to lay down your life for him, he would do the same for you. Never doubt that." Bakugo's head dips, his hair casting long shadows over his eyes. His lips are pressed into a thin, miserable line, but there's something relieved about him, too. Like a very heavy weight has just been lifted off of his shoulders, one that he's been carrying for all his life, and he's finally able to stand tall again. "Thank you," he rasps low, and Shouta's heart gives an emphatic kick. "Aizawa-sensei." He nods. "Get some rest." This time, Bakugo doesn't stop him. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 7 of Fellow Feeling. Chapter 8 will be up next, just 2 more chapters to go in this fic. So let me know your thoughts and reactions to everything so far in this one, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.